Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoteric and a continuing series on Valve's Steam Deck, more importantly how to get emulators set up, and when you do, what games you should be playing per platform. And today we're on to one of my favorite consoles of all time, the Sega Genesis or Megadrive. And I understand that everyone grew up with these systems, so you might be new to the console via Steam Deck emulation, so I'm here to recommend some absolutely incredible games to you, but just be aware, these aren't going to be the things you see on the top 10 greatest games of all time list. These are more deep cut things that I love. Before we get too far involved, go down below, hit like and subscribe, all that jazz. Well, let's just get into the video with Alien Soldier. If you like 16-bit run and gun games, you're going to love this one, and I always love when a game references the future and it's already past. In the year 2015, there was a terrible crisis on Earth. If they had said 2020, they would have been way more on the nose. But if you like a difficult game, Alien Soldier is going to have 100% of what you need in it. This is not an easy game. When you die, it is game over. But it has some absolutely amazing mechanics and graphics for the Sega Genesis. This is just one of those games that I've been playing for like the last 2 decades, and I pick it up, I give it a go, I play it for 20 minutes, and I absolutely love my time with it. But when I say it is hard, I really do mean it. This game pulls no punches whatsoever, and you're going to be spending a ton of time seeing the game over screen. But you continually get better, understand your weapon selection, kind of navigating the levels here and understanding the boss patterns, and the more you learn and the more you experience, the more the game becomes fun and it makes you want to play just one more time to see how much further you can get. It's also just a great graphical showcase of what the Sega Genesis could do, so 10 out of 10 recommend Alien Soldier. I think you're going to have an absolute blast with this one, and I don't hear as many people mention it as I wish I did. Now moving on more to an action platformer RPG is Monster World 4. This is a translation and it's an absolutely spectacular one at that. This entire franchise is incredible, but I love the visual aesthetics of Monster World. All of these nice colors, these pastel greens, the parallax clouds scrolling in the background. This game visually looks spectacular, but it's also an amazing adventure that has a little bit of a Metroidvania vibe to it as well. It's just another amazing game on the Sega Genesis, or in this instance the Megadrive, 2 names, same console, and I think it's one that a lot more people should be playing, and it's one of those things, maybe this will show up on some lists of the greatest games of all time, but definitely not all of them, and that's what these videos are all about, because obviously you know you want to play Sonic the Hedgehog if you never have before, but you don't need to watch a video to be told that. This is more deep cut status stuff. But this game is just an absolute blast, side-scrolling, hack-and-slash fun. All of the enemy sprites are really well animated and have a ton of personality. And that's why I love this game as much as I do. The personality of it is just there in spades. Every single screen has something new to look at. The parallax scrolling is great, and there's so many different environments. You gotta figure out where you need to be going next and what you need to be doing, and that is so much of the fun. But it also has a great soundtrack. Everything about this game is just good. I can't think of a single negative for it. And it's one of those things, with the Steam Deck support and save states, pick it up and play it, go on the train, head to work, play like 20-30 minutes, and then pick it up where you left off. You're going to have an absolute ton of fun with this one. I guarantee it your money back, but remember, you don't pay me for these videos, so that guarantee is absolutely worthless at this point in time. But you could do a lot worse than this game. Just take my word for it. And if you have played it, leave me a comment down below. And just leave me a comment down below and tell me what your favorite Sega Genesis game of all time is. I would be interested to hear that. But moving on to another action platformer that involves Sega that does not involve a hedgehog or any of his woodland creature friends, we're going to be talking about Pulseman, because I absolutely love this game and I think it's one of the best 2D side-scrollers on the Genesis and Mega Drive. And right off the top, I just love the aesthetic of this game. The oranges, the yellows, the reds, the Sega building in the background, all of those lights flashing back and forth. This game just has an absolute vibe and I'm 100% there for it. But that vibe is married to a spectacular action platform game with a ton of diverse enemies, different diverse stages. It has so much going for it, but this is never going to get mentioned in the same conversation as something like Sonic and Knuckles, which I think is unfortunate because it's as fun as that game, even if content-wise it is slightly different in the gameplay department. But there is so much fun to be had with Pulseman. It is an amazing game, and it's amazing visually as well, and it's just one of those games, if you've never played it before, I can basically almost guarantee you will enjoy it. And it's got a very interesting soundtrack as well. It's not very rhythmic, but it does sound good on the Genesis, so go ahead and listen for like 45 seconds. I'll be back with more Genesis games you just need to play. Very unique soundtrack, but leave me a comment down below and tell me what you think. Now, on the same vein, the 2D platformer, this one made by Sega and has a lot of resemblances to Sonic the Hedgehog, but still isn't, is going to be Rise Star. Now, this is basically what happens if you take Sonic the Hedgehog as a concept, but remove all of the speed from the blue blur and give that same concept to a very slow character. Because even in the intro here, if that doesn't look like Sonic on the Sega Genesis, I do not know what does. But Rise Star is a very slow character that has a completely different moveset and way to navigate through the world. But this, to me, is one of the most visually interesting games on the Sega Genesis. The colors, the parallax scrolling, all of the different graphical effects going on, it just 100% works. And if you're a little bit tired of playing Sonic games and just running right, trying to get to the end of the stage, and you want a platformer that makes you think a little bit more and gives you a little bit of light puzzle solving and traversal of the environments, then Rise Star is 100% going to be for you. But like I said, visually this is one of my favorite games on the Sega Genesis, and on the Steam Deck screen it looks absolutely spectacular as well. And I do like that it slows you down, because as much as I love Sonic the Hedgehog and running as fast as humanly possible, or I guess as hedgehogly possible, I do like a game that kind of gives you a little bit more time to play around with what's going on. And you'll see Rise Star here has these extendable arms that allow you to grab onto different enemies and objects in the environment, and that's a lot of what you're going to be doing in Rise Star, is figuring out how to traverse the world, what path is the best forward, and using those arms to navigate around. But it's just one of those things. It is an all-time classic in my opinion, but it's probably not one of those games that if you've never played the Genesis you're going to go to first, but I'm here to recommend you do exactly that. Now onto my absolutely favorite Sega Genesis game of all time, although I am playing the Megadrive version, is going to be Splatterhouse Part 2. I grew up renting this game from my local video store as a kid. I've loved the entire Splatterhouse franchise since the moment I first played it in arcades, and this is my favorite game in the series. And this was a big delineating factor between Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis back in the day. Nintendo had that family-friendly image where Sega allowed more gore on their system, and you can't get much more gore than swinging a 2x4 and plowing it into a monster's face, splattering him on the wall. They don't call it Splatterhouse for nothing, folks. But this is just an absolute classic beat 'em up, and it is one of those games that I think is just so synonymous and iconic with the Sega Genesis. When people think about the hardware, at least when I do, I think of Splatterhouse immediately. And the first boss here is just this gigantic mass of flesh that vomits at you, and when you beat him, his stomach bursts open and all of that acid leaks out. This is just one of those games that is so iconic, I absolutely love it, but if you talk about the best beat 'em ups on the Genesis, it's probably not going to show up on many lists, and that really does bum me out, because I would put it right up there with some other obvious picks, one of which we'll definitely talk about in this video, because how could I not? But this soundtrack is also one of my favorites on Genesis, so go ahead and listen for 30 seconds and I'll be back with some more games. And did you think I was going to do a Sega Genesis recommendation video and not talk about Streets of Rage 2, even though it's an obvious pick? Well, there is no way I would forget this game. It is one of my favorite beat 'em ups of all time, and it's just an absolutely iconic Sega game. But leave me a comment down below and tell me what you think the best beat 'em up of the 16-bit era is, because I would be curious. You can include arcade or home console. But if you were new to the Sega Genesis, if you didn't grow up with one, and you're just kind of getting into checking out the library, you cannot skip Streets of Rage 2. It would be a sin to miss this game. This is Sega at their absolute best in the beat 'em up genre. It is basically unparalleled. Of course, there is Final Fight in arcades and on the Super Nintendo as well, and I'm not saying that Streets of Rage 2 is better than that game. They do feel different enough to stand on their own. But this was one of the things that people would point to back in the day when Super Nintendo fans and Sega fans would argue on playgrounds. I don't think that actually happened, at least I don't remember it happening, but that's always the joke. But this was one of those iconic Sega Genesis games, and it holds up as well today as it did on the day it came out. And maybe it's something you haven't played for 5, 10, 15 years and you're thinking, do I really need to go back to it? Well, the answer to that is an unequivocal 100% yes. Play it if you haven't, replay it if it's been some years. Whatever you do, make sure you give Streets of Rage 2 a try. And again, this is another one of those games that just works perfect in handheld mode, because of course I'm capturing all this footage docked, but I am going to be on a plane shortly, and I'm going to be definitely bringing my Steam Deck with me, and this is the type of thing that just makes flights go by so quickly. It's 35 tight minutes of beat 'em up action, and then you can move on. But visually, music-wise, gameplay-wise, Streets of Rage 2 is an absolute 10 out of 10. There is nothing about this game that I would change whatsoever. The only bad thing about it is inevitably you beat it and it ends and you need to move on to something different, just like this video needs to move on to the next game. Not a bad segue there, just made that up. Phantasy Star, The End of the Millennium, 10 out of 10 role-playing game on the Sega Genesis, and the Genesis has a lot of good RPGs. It's not just the Super Nintendo that you want to look towards when you think of RPGs and JRPGs. The Genesis did bring the heat as well, but I will give the edge to SNES for having more of them. But a game like this is just going to engross you. It's going to be an absolute huge adventure. It's the type of game that you can play in 30-minute to an hour chunks, or just sit there and put 5 hours into whatever you want to do. It's got a great story. It has absolutely outstanding graphics with these little cutaway vignettes here. It's just a game that you think, oh, I'm going to check this out, it's probably going to be fun. Then suddenly 4.5 hours have gone by and you wonder how the hell your day got away from you just by playing a JRPG on Sega Genesis on your Steam Deck. It's got great dungeons, the monster battle encounters are awesome, and I love the art as well. Whatever the hell these things are, these spider brains that are just pulsating on the ground, every single enemy in this game has a fun and unique design, and you're always going to be curious what happens next, both in the story and the environments, but also just what monsters you're going to see the next time you come around. So trust me, you want to play this one. And another one you want to play is going to be Shining Force 2, same genre, different game, different experience entirely, and another absolutely classic RPG on the Genesis and Mega Drive. And just like the first game, it's one of those things you're just going to get sucked into the story. And the story is definitely different than the first game I just showed you, and that is a good thing. Now, I wouldn't play these back to back. This is one of those things, pick an RPG, play it, and then play some other stuff, and then come back to the genre. But this game, again, just has everything you want in an RPG on the Genesis. And it's one of those things, once you kick off the adventure, you're going to be engrossed in the story. You're going to want to know what happens next. And I'm only showing you the very beginning of these games because I don't really want to spoil anything. Classic RPG story. You're a kid, you wake up in bed in your house and you go talk to mom. That is in like 8 of every 10 RPGs from back in the day. Leave me a comment down below and tell me of an RPG that doesn't have this formula in the 16-bit era. I'd be curious which ones don't. But as usual, there's going to be something that happens and that's going to kick off your adventure. This one gives me some Chrono Trigger vibes, and that's always a good thing to compare it to, but the soundtrack on this one, I absolutely love it. Listen 30 seconds and I'll be right back. This game just has absolutely everything I need. It's got an incredible story, incredible gameplay, soundtrack, and visuals. But if you don't want to lose a ton of hours to your life, do not start playing this. But the reason I put it on this list, and I know it is a more commonly known game, is I feel like when people talk about 16-bit RPGs, the Super Nintendo always leads the conversation, and that does make sense because it has some of the most iconic games of all time on it. But the Genesis and Mega Drive were no slouch whatsoever, and Shining Force 2 is a perfect example of how much RPG fun you can have on this system. Now moving over to something completely different is Toe Jam and Earl, the original game, not Panic on Funkatron. This is where it's at. This was Sega's personality back in the 16-bit era, and you can 100% see where all the absurd games from the Dreamcast that would come years later were formed. Toe Jam and Earl is a very slow game where you just wander around a world, fighting enemies and finding spaceship parts. It is the simplest game at face value, but this is so much about what the Sega Genesis was compared to the Super Nintendo. It had a funny personality, and I love these cutaways. It looks like something ripped straight from Saved by the Bell. But I'm curious who played Toe Jam and Earl back in the day. It is one of my favorite games on the Sega Genesis of all time. But sadly, again, it's another one that I don't hear that many people mention. I would be curious who grew up with it and who came to it later in life. And the greatest part is you can play this as a two-player experience as well. If you're having people over for a game night, just throw this on. Maybe they've never seen it before, or maybe you played it almost 30 years ago and you haven't stopped back in. But Toe Jam and Earl is just one of those games. When I think of the Sega Genesis, it always pops into my mind, and that's because I had it back in the day. I bought it blind as a kid. I saw the cover art and I said to myself, well, this looks like something I would enjoy playing, and child me was 100% right. But I also absolutely love the soundtrack in Toe Jam and Earl. It is one of those iconic sounds that I can't get out of my head, and after the next 30 seconds, you won't be able to either. It's just this weird crunchy 16-bit bass heavy soundtrack, but it absolutely works, and it's one of those things I can just hum it in my imagination if I'm walking around. That's how much Toe Jam and Earl I played back in the day, and if you've never checked it out, you 100% owe it to yourself to do so. But of course I've got to include some shmups on this list. It's a big genre with a lot of fans, and I am one of them, and for me, Musha here is one of the best on the system. Absolutely love it. 10 out of 10, recommend. Hall of Fame, first ballot all day long, and all the other kitschy terms I throw at games on this series. But all jokes aside, this is just a spectacular vertical shmup that is going to absolutely suck you in. It is not the hardest game in the world, so if you are new to shmups or you're just an intermediate player, you're still going to find a lot to love here. But I just love the setting, this kind of futuristic feudal Japan where you have all these different Japanese style buildings that are also floating in the sky, and all these warships here with the skulls on them. This game has a ton of vibe, and it absolutely nails the shmup mechanics. It doesn't use a ton of colors, I will say that, but what they do with the colorways does work here. But you're going to be seeing a lot of browns and a lot of yellows and a lot of blues, but it does work. But I mean, what can you say negatively about the first boss? This is a giant Japanese looking temple on 4 different treads, and it's basically a temple battle mech rolling down the countryside with what looks like a skull squid on the top. You will see that some of the power-ups you can get, I am destroying this fire before it even gets to me, and a lot of what this game is that power-up selection. You're going to find power-ups that work perfectly for one situation that are absolute garbage for the next one, so a lot of the mechanics of this game and being successful in it are kind of navigating all of the power-up system and deciding what works for you and what works for the situation, because having this rotating orb around me is definitely making the game easier, but that is part of what's going on here, and I just love these cyborg ninjas that jump out of the walls at you. This is just a game, if you even remotely like shmups and you're checking out new games on the Sega Genesis on your Steam Deck, you 100% should check this one out because you're going to have an absolute ton of fun with it. It's an iconic game, it's an amazing game, and it's one of my favorites of all time in the shmup genre on the Genesis. But keeping with the shmup theme, we have Battlemania Daijinju here, and it is a very quirky and odd game. And leave me a comment down below and tell me if I got that pronunciation right, because a lot of you are very helpful with pronunciations. It is not my strong suit, even though I look up how to pronounce things. It's not how my brain works. But every once in a while I get a comment saying I'm a terrible filmmaker because I get it wrong. Did not realize that was a qualification or film school in my 20-year career history behind a camera. But hey, if I get it wrong, I tried my best, and if it upsets you, I'm not really too worried about it. All jokes aside, moving on, this is an absolutely spectacular game with a very interesting sense of humor and aesthetic to it. And while it is mostly a horizontal shmup, it does have some vertical levels. But I love this starting out stage. We have these giant Japanese demon fish coming at us, where we can see the moon in the pseudo reflection of this gigantic skyscraper that we continue to traverse upwards towards. And then we get these amazing, I think that they are some sort of umbrella monster. I do not know, and I'm sure some of these monsters are from Japanese lore, so if you do know what they are, leave me a comment down below. It is not my historical strong suit to know all the Japanese demons, but I do love looking at them. And this is just one of those games, I don't hear it mentioned very often whatsoever, but it's an awesome shmup, a really interesting game visually on the Sega Genesis, and it is just an absolute ton of fun to play with a lot of interesting and deep mechanics in the genre. And I just love this first boss here. Seems like something that would have come out of Ghouls and Ghosts, and our partner drives the car out of the building to crush him on the head, the most Fast and Furious thing to ever happen before the Fast and Furious franchise ever did exist. But between each stage you're going to get a story, and this is a translation because this is not a game that came out in North America, and the story translates really well even though it is very absurd. But as we go into the next stage here, we're going to see that we are on a fully horizontal shmup stage, and I do like that it mixes and matches those. But this game also has an absolutely incredible soundtrack. Go ahead and listen for 30 seconds and I'll come back and recommend one more game for you to play. Just a great soundtrack, and the last game I have on this list is Twinkle Tale. If you've ever played Pocky and Rocky on the Super Nintendo, you're going to understand the genre of this game, but unlike Pocky and Rocky, you're rarely ever going to hear anyone talk about this one. It is hard as nails. It's going to kill you time and time again. It's going to bring you in the back alley, mug you, and leave you for dead, and that's what I love about it. It is just pure challenge, and I can't recommend it enough. But these are the Sega Genesis and Megadrive games I recommend you check out on your Steam Deck, but leave me a comment down below and tell me what one game you would have included that I did not hear, because I would be curious. These are hard videos to make, paring down an entire library to a 20-minute segment. Short of that, I'll have another Steam Deck video next Saturday, and I'll have videos throughout the week as well, but we are done. I'm going to die, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.